Hello, everybody, and welcome to Braygarden Markets Wine Cache number 7, the wines of South America. So we're already doing our 7th wine club. We're also going very broad again in terms of the topic we're covering in South America. So with these wine clubs and these wine videos or little tastings that we do, we're going to kind of continue to go broad and then eventually narrow our focus onto various regions. So for this particular class, the wines of South America, we're going to be talking about the 3 most important wine countries in South America in terms of what comes here to the U.S. Those, of course, or I shouldn't say of course, one of them might be a little bit of a surprise, but the first 2 will not be. Argentina, which almost anybody who drinks wine is familiar with, as well as Chile, again, very popular wines from Chile here in the United States. And then Uruguay, believe it or not. Uruguay has come a long way in the last 20 years in winemaking. They've had a lot of Spanish, obviously, in the 17th, 18th centuries, and then also a lot of Italian and French immigrants that settled there and brought grapes over. And so it was always kind of a place where wine was made, but it's become more popular again in the United States in the last 10 or 15 years. It's still growing in popularity. You won't see a whole section of Uruguay wines probably in a shop or a Uruguay section of wines in a restaurant, but it is gaining momentum. They make outstanding whites, they make really good rosé, and excellent reds with a lesser known grape in terms of how much it's used in the rest of the world, called Tannat. But we'll get to that a little later. That'll be actually the last wine that we taste. So talking about South America as a whole is a little difficult. Every country is very unique in terms of its culture, its cuisine, types of wine, styles of wines that they make. But there are some overlapping similarities that kind of go into being able to talk about South America as a wine producing continent, and then as we get into the 3 different countries as wine producing countries. So most of South America, in terms of where the wine industry started, came because of colonization. And initially, a lot of South America, as a lot of you know, was colonized by the Spanish, and then a little bit in Portugal by the Portuguese, if we're talking Brazil. So the Spanish were the first to bring grapes into South America. And we actually have a wine with one of the varietals that the Spanish originally brought over, which you see very little of here in the United States, called País, or in California they call it the Mission grape. Mission grape, or País, was also one of the first red wine varietals to come to the United States from Mexico. It was brought by missionaries, Catholic missionaries, who were kind of migrating north with a lot of other migrant workers and immigrants at the time. And we're talking, 1800s here, even a little, 1800s, mid 1800s or so. And it's called Mission grapes because the wine was brought over, carried over, and produced by missionaries. So again, religious folk always have their hands in history of winemaking, even here in the New World, it seems. But in Central and South America, País was a very famous grape brought over by the Spanish. We'll get into more a little bit about the history of the grape and that type of wine, but we do have an example of that wine. And it's actually really nice. It's actually, I was very pleasantly surprised. So after the Spanish colonization and Spanish colonies and the Spanish Empire kind of fell apart, and the last remnants of the Spanish Empire really began to crumble early 19th century. So by the 1820s, 1830s, Spain lost a grip, a hold through various revolutions throughout South America, Central America. And then you had still a number of Europeans coming over, but European immigrants investing and settling in parts of South America that the Spanish had once controlled or colonized. And a lot of these immigrants, especially from Italy and France, brought over grape varietals. And so you had a first wave of immigration after the fall or the eventual crumble and collapse of the Spanish Empire in the 1820s. And then you had like a second wave of immigration from Europe coming to South America, again in the 1890s. A lot of Europeans in the 1890s who moved over to South America were winemakers because they were actually getting out of Europe, France, Spain, Italy, to escape phylloxera, which was ravaging European vineyards at this time. And so they were trying to find places where they could continue their trade, continue their craft, continue to make wine that was not affected by this dreadful disease. And many parts of South America fit the bill perfectly in terms of climate, in terms of growing conditions, and in terms of availability of grapes that were already there. But also in the 1890s, a lot of these immigrants from Europe into South America also brought more grapes. And so you had kind of the burgeoning of this, the beginnings of this great wine industry. And fascinatingly enough, phylloxera never really affected certain parts of South America. Everyone talks about Chile and how Chile has never had phylloxera, and that's true. Scientists still don't know why. They think it might have something to do with the dry soil, especially the dry clay soils. It might have something to do with the way they irrigate their fields. You know, it's a little different than they do in Europe. They have a great irrigation system in Chile based on their location with the Andes Mountains. We'll get into that a little later. But still, that doesn't completely explain why phylloxera has never hit Chile. Most botanists, scientists, not botanists, well, I guess botanists as well, scientists believe that it will eventually hit Chile, but still hasn't. But Argentina hasn't been hit with phylloxera either. So people talk about Chile, but also Argentina has not been afflicted with phylloxera. And so these were great locations for people to relocate and to start anew, as much of the wine industry during the late 19th century in Europe was just being decimated. And then eventually in the 20th century, you had, after years of kind of poor economies, political instability, you began to have the foundation of and growth of stability, of some economic wealth, and that kind of last part of it, where these countries became a little more stable economically, socioeconomically, were able to kind of grow the wine industry. That's not to say everything is roses and peaches in certain parts of Chile and Argentina, but as a whole, these countries have really come a long way in terms of wine production. So that's a really brief and not nearly as in-depth enough history of wines in South America. And like I said, you can go into each country and each has its own history, of course, its own culture. But these are some of the factors that led to the growth of wines in South America, and in part at least how they became, or how the industry became what it is today. So that being said, let's start diving into the individual countries. All right, take 7. It is so humid and hot. The first wine we're going to do today is from Argentina. Argentina is, at least in terms of what we drink here in the US and based on production, the most popular, fastest growing area of production, country of production in South America. It fluctuates a little year to year, but they're always usually between like 4th and 6th in terms of worldwide production of wine, which puts them right up there with Italy, Spain, France. There are certainly some years where they produce more wine in Argentina than in the US. They are also one of the world's leaders in consumption of wine in terms of consumption per capita. So it's a culture that cares obviously very much about wine. You know, ironically, if you were in the wine industry in the 80s and especially in the 90s, if you were betting on a country in South America to kind of take the world by storm from a wine producing standpoint, it would have been Chile. Chile was really on a fast track for becoming the next global wine superpower there in the 80s and 90s. And in some ways, they Chile, we'll get into that later, did hit that mark. But by the mid-2000s, I would say Argentina passed them. And that's nothing against Chile, it's just the amazing progress they've made in Argentina with wine production. A lot of that progress came with investment, both within the country itself. So the Argentinian government saw its own potential in the wine industry and invested money in winemaking, and then a lot of foreign investment as well. You had a number of backers in the U.S., including Paul Hobbs, famous winemaker, who invested money and time in producing great wine out of Argentina. You had a lot of French investment as well, including from the family, the Baron Rothschilds, from Italy as well. So a lot of people recognized early on the potential of wine production in Argentina, and it's paid off. You know, everyone knows what Malbec is, and a lot of people enjoy Malbec. Malbec is indeed king of grapes in Argentina, whether you're talking about red and white. And where Malbec is just kind of a middling grape in most other parts of the world. It originally comes from France. It's used as a blending grape in Bordeaux. They make Malbec in Cahors, where it's often called Cat. They make a little bit like in the Loire Valley and other parts of France, and it goes by different names in different regions. But usually, it's kind of a middling grape. It produces in a lot of the rest of the world, although there are some exceptions. Kind of okay wine, not great. You know, a lot of Malbec that comes from Cahors is good, but very little of it is truly outstanding. But in Argentina, Malbec really sings and really kind of hits the heights of its potential. And some of the best red wines now in the world are made in Argentina and are made from Malbec. They certainly have other grapes as well that they use, Cabernet, Merlot. They blend a lot of these varietals as well. And so it's kind of just taken off tremendously. All that being said, we are trying a Malbec. Everyone is familiar with it, and so with this Wine Cash Club, we try to do something different. And so we're going to focus a little more on like Chile and a little bit on Uruguay later on. But for the first wine, I thought we would do this Elsa Bianchi Torrontés. Torrontés is one of the major white varietals that grows in and is produced in Argentina. Torrontés is actually a crossing of sorts between two grapes, in particular Muscat Alexandria, Muscat of Alexandria, and Listan Prieto. Listan Prieto is mission grape. It's the Pais grape. So Listan Prieto is a grape that's originally from Spain, that was brought from Spain to Argentina and other parts of South America and Central America. And it was used to make cheap and simple wine. In fact, in parts of Chile, it's still used to make cheap, inexpensive jug wine. There are a few really interesting producers doing some really interesting things with this grape. But over time, the Prieto grape became known as the Pais grape in South America and the Mission grape in California. It wasn't until, I think, sometime in the late 20th, early 21st century that they did some genetic testings on it and said, oh, well, this is actually Listan Prieto from Spain. And that was crossed with Muscat of Alexandria, and you got this grape called Torrontés. So a white wine varietal, a red wine varietal, had a kid, and what came out is Torrontés. And Torrontés you see in Uruguay as well, other parts of South America, but it's kind of, the national, close to a national white grape, I guess. It doesn't have nearly the cachet of Malbec in Argentina, but it is produced quite abundantly over there. And Torrontés are fantastic wines. They're usually fairly inexpensive, usually great values. If you were to compare it to something, it would almost be like a cross between Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Grigio. It has some of that citrus and tropical those tropical notes of Sauvignon Blanc, but without the acidity. There is some acid there, obviously, and it's usually really well balanced, but it's not as sharp as a Sauvignon Blanc. So it's almost like someone cut it with a little Pinot Grigio or something to kind of mellow it out. But they're delicious wines. The Elsa Bianchi from Mendoza is wonderful. It's one of my kind of favorite go-to in the spring and summertime on hot days like this. And like I said, it's got really pretty floral, citrusy, slightly tropical notes to it. It's a beautiful wine, and yeah, I hope you enjoy Elsa Bianchi Torrontés from Argentina. All right, so for our next two wines, we're going to be focusing in on Chile. Chile, as I had mentioned earlier, was really in the 80s and 90s kind of booming in terms of wine production, in terms of wine exports, especially to this country and to the UK. And then kind of, it didn't slow down necessarily, but was eventually surpassed by Argentina in terms of what we drink here in America and what we view as kind of quality wines. Chile was known in the 80s and 90s for producing great value wines, and the wines from Chile were, for the most part, inexpensive, but which led to a lot of sales, which to this day leads to a lot of case stacks for certain wines from Chile in bigger supermarkets and things like that. But if anything kind of slowed that down is that the one downside to that is you become known as a region or a country or an area that produces cheap wine. And then when you produce more expensive wine, no matter how great it is, people are used to spending a certain amount of money on wines from a certain area. This happened to Chile. This happened to certain regions of Spain to a certain extent as well. So certain regions of France. It really kind of happens everywhere. But Chile, because of its location, because it's able to produce such large quantities of wine, and large quantities of pretty good wine for such good price, because Chile is kind of right in like the perfect growing region, or one of the most perfect growing regions in the world. I mean, the five main regions that grow wine in Chile are, you have the Pacific Ocean to the west, and then behind you are the Andes Mountains. So when the Andes Mountains melt, the snow melts, you have this kind of perfect resource for irrigation. The cool winds off of the Pacific, the soil type, the physical isolation, because you're surrounded by a mountain or an ocean, you don't get nearly the amount of pestilence and disease that other areas that make wine, other regions that make wine might be kind of vulnerable to. And so with that perfect kind of growing region, you also have, for the most part, pretty inexpensive land, and unfortunately for the laborers, pretty inexpensive laborers. And so you're able to sell wine at a really great price and able to sell quite a bit of it. People kind of grew used to and accustomed to inexpensive wine from Chile. It didn't mean it was bad. Again, there's a lot of good stuff coming out of there, especially for the price, but it took a while for Chile to kind of regroup and restructure itself. And while they're still making a lot of inexpensive wine, they make some great wine as well at all types of prices. And the growth of Chilean wine and the growth of quality Chilean wine has finally kind of taken a turn for the better, I think, in terms of perception. I mean, you have places like Casa La Postel, which anything Casa La Postel does is fantastic, but their Clos Alpalta in particular is just, I think it's best wine in the world from Wine Spectator. It got number 1 on the top 100 lists, I think, a couple times. It's gotten number 2. It's been in the top 5, and it's really one of the great wines of the world. And like Concha y Toro makes Don Melchor, which I think they released this year, which was the 2018, has a good chance of being literally number one on the Wine Spectator Top 100. It was rated a 100-point wine by actually a number of critics. But yeah, and Don Melchor has been producing great wines because Conchitoro is the winery, but the Don Melchor label has just been phenomenal for, God, I don't know, 20 plus years now, at least as long as I've been in the wine business, maybe a little longer. And these wines are expensive, but even these wines, as great as they are still good value. I mean, both the Don Melchor and the Clos Alpalta run for a little over 100. It'll be somewhere between 100 and 115 or 120, depending upon where you're buying it. At a restaurant, of course, it'll be quite a bit higher. But point being, these are world-class wines that regularly score in the 96 to 100 point range. Not that points are everything, but you know, it's not just one person saying they're 100 points or 98 points. It's like all the critics. That's, you know, how do I do, you know, what do I do with points? Well, find someone that you like. If you like Robert Parker's review, if you like Wilfred Wong, if you have the same kind of palate as James Suckling, that'll help. But if you see a wine that's highly rated across the board by like all the critics, like, you know, it's a no-brainer. And so while $110 to $120 isn't inexpensive, it certainly is expensive for most people, including myself. In terms of that level of winemaking, that is pretty inexpensive still. So if someone asks me, so when people come in and say, hey, what should I buy? And they'll point at different wines from, I'm thinking about this wine from California, this wine from France, or even this wine from Washington, and at $250, $300, I'm happy to sell those. But I'm also quick to recommend, hey, if you don't, you know, if you're going to do something like this for a wine tasting or a wine dinner, you can get two incredible wines like Clos Alpalta and Don Melchor for the same price as one of those, and the wines are just as good. It's just a matter of where they're produced, and kind of the name on the bottle, I guess, a little bit, and popularity. A lot of that plays into it as you get higher into price stratosphere. So anyway, I'm rambling on about Chile, but they've really started to change their reputation again as a country that makes good wines at all price points, I guess, is my main point. And there are some producers now doing some really cool things with some of the ancient varietals as well, and we're going to get into that right now. So our first red wine is a really cool label. It comes in a liter bottle. It's Pequeño Portezuelo, and that's actually made by a gentleman named Luis Antoine Liot, if I'm pronouncing that right. He's actually French. My French is terrible. I've probably butchered his name. I apologize. But he is French. I think his family's originally from Burgundy. And but he's invested a lot of time and effort. I think he's full-time now and spends all his time. He is Chilean for all intents and purposes. And just recognizes the potential of Chile and kind of, he's in Colchagua Valley, I believe. I'm not sure where he is. I gotta look that up. I apologize. But he kind of is doing a number of different things, including resurrecting kind of this País grape, this mission grape that I talked about earlier, the Lista Prieto from Spain. And he's creating these beautiful wines that are almost like really good Cru Beaujolais with this País grape. And the grapes and the vineyards he's using, although a lot of País is made in Chile still as like jug wine, these vines will age longer than even Zinfandel vines, and they've been around longer, so they can age that long. And the vines he's using to make this mission grape wine, this País grape wine, is they're 150 to 200 years old. So really, really ancient vines. When you see ancient vines on most labels, it can mean anything from 10 years to 100 years, but we're talking 150 to 200 years here. This is truly ancient vines wines. It's a natural wine, and organic, and it just smells beautiful fruit, a little spice, And it really does taste like a really good Beaujolais Cru. So Gamay. So this is like, and not, you know, I guess not to put too fine a, something from like Moulin Event, a slightly heavier Fleury, kind of somewhere in that taste range. But it's beautiful wine. And this is kind of a producer we just kind of discovered recently, but it's from a wine portfolio that we like a lot, Louis Dresner. Louis Dresner, of course, specializes in naturally fermented wines, mostly all organic or biodynamic producers. And this is outstanding. And for like cool factor, again, 200-year-old Mission grapes, you really can't beat it. If I was going to pair this with something, I would do the same thing I would do with like a Cru Beaujolais. If you wanted to do like a game bird, would be perfect, like a squab, or this would go excellent with duck. And it's light enough to go with fish, like salmon or tuna. That is really outstanding stuff. So I highly encourage you, drink a bottle. If you like it, come back and get some more. Excellent stuff from Pipeño Portezuelo and Louis Anton Liut. Cheers. All right, so we had a great 200-year-old, 150 to 200-year-old Mission grape first. So our second wine from Chile is gonna be, really cool label again, Villalobos, Villa of the Wolf, I believe. The Spanish is not great either. But Carmenere. And so Carmenere is an interesting grape. It's really kind of hit and miss for me and for a lot of people as well. Carmenere can hit tremendous heights, also very low lows. Carmenere comes from France originally, and it used to be one of the, at the time where you could do 6 grapes to blend in Bordeaux, Carmenere was one of the grapes. Now there's only 5, and Carmenere is no longer one of them. So Cabernet Sauvignon, Cab Franc, Merlot, Petit Verdot, Malbec, and it used to be able to do Carmenere as well. Carmenere actually almost went extinct in France. Made a little bit of a comeback, but you still don't see much of it in France. It did make it over to Chile during one of those periods of immigration to South America that I told you about. And Carmenere is now grown more in Chile than probably anywhere else in the world. It's, you know, it's not quite the Malbec of Chile, and this kind of, I think, is part of why Argentina passed Chile, is that Carmenere kind of was and is still, in a way, Chile's national grape, but it does not have the consistency that Malbec does. This wine comes from Colchagua. So Colchagua is in the Valle Central. So there's 5 major wine regions in, like, broad wine regions in Chile. Aconcagua, and Valle Central are the 2 most important. And within Valle Central, you have Colchagua, you have Mal, you have Maipo, a few other subregions within there that are really, really well known and produce really, really good wines. Chile does produce some outstanding Cabernet and Merlot, which we're not tasting today. They're starting to get really good at Pinot Noir, and there's some excellent Syrahs that come out of Chile as well. So, like I said earlier when we were talking about, like, at the little introduction of Chile part, it was really the last 10, 15, 20 years that they've turned the corner in terms of reputation for quality wines. Not that they never made quality wines, but just that it weren't as well known for the quality wines, and that's kind of changed quite a bit, thankfully. And so Carmenere, like I said, I just spent, you can always smell Carmenere from a mile away, but this smells like outstanding Carmenere. So here's the deal. Carmenere sometimes can be a little underripe and too green. So it has like a green, when it's not made well, it has a very intense green peppery kind of thing going on that makes it kind of out of balance and unpleasant. When it's really good, there's still that greenness in there, but it's balanced with fruit and spice, sometimes earthiness and gaminess. And so it kind of varies quite a bit. Um, it's worth noting, and a lot of people know this, Carmenere for years and years and years was thought to be Merlot. It's a very similar grape in terms of looks and even genetics, but a number of years back, some grapes were sent up to UC Davis Santa Barbara. They did a full kind of DNA genetic test on it, and they realized that the stuff that they thought was Merlot was actually Carmenere. And since then, Chile has been making varietals, wines with Carmenere, either as 100% varietals or as blends. So I smell this and I look at this, and I'm acting more surprised than usual because I haven't tasted this wine before. I told one of my wine reps that we wanted something that is Carmenere, but really Carmenere, that really speaks to what the Chilean winemakers do with Carmenere. Now he assured me, he's like, this is great. This Villalobos, really small winery, doing some amazing things in Colchagua. If you don't like it, send it back. Don't give it to your customers. But based on the smell, you're getting some. That is amazing. That is really, really well done. Wow. That's one of the better sips of wine I've had all year. So this is excellent Carmenere. On the nose, you can tell it's Carmenere right away. Good Carmenere. It's kind of like good Cab Franc. Sometimes you get it on the nose and you tell, that's Cab Franc, that's Carmenere right away. Even if you don't have a ton of wine experience, there's something very distinctive about it. And with Carmenere, and somewhat with Cab Franc, there's a certain greenness to it. Sometimes that translates into tobacco leaf, sometimes that translates into bell pepper, but there's a very distinct greenness to these wines. And like I said, depending upon the quality of the wine, you can go too far one way or the other and kind of throw off the balance and make the wine not terrible, but just not super great either. This wine does not go too far one way or the other. It's got this great spice, there is this greenness, there is great fruit to it. It's not overly tannic, but has a little bit of grip. There's almost this gaminess to it as well. And this beautiful earthiness, but like it's a bright earthiness. It's not like a dank, mushroomy, it's more like a bright green forest floor type of earthiness. Man, this is good. So, enjoy the Lobo 2018 Carmenere as much as I am. Actually gonna pour myself a little more. Excuse me for a minute, I'll be right back. So our last wine, as I said earlier, is from Uruguay. Uruguay is really an upcoming wine country. They've had wine grapes there since around the 1870s or so. The first wine grapes were brought over by Basque immigrants. Basque is this incredible cultural there's part of it's in Spain, part of it's in France, kind of right along the Pyrenees Mountains there. But throughout history, they've been great explorers, great Epicureans, great authors, pretty much great at everything. And so Basque immigrants from that area brought the first grapes over to Uruguay. And wine, though, did not really become that important in terms of large-scale production, in terms of exporting for trade until the 1980s and 1990s. And surprisingly, the grape that Uruguay has become best known for is a grape called Tannat, T-A-N-N-A-T, which is originally from France. And Tannat is, I guess if you want to find single varietals of Tannat in France, you would go to Madiran. And the reason why I find, and a lot of people find that Uruguay has kind of mastered and kind of made this, the Tannat, their kind of primary red grape, is because it's usually a very difficult grape to make palatable, especially when it's young. And I don't mean palatable in like a bad way. It's very thick skin. It produces such tannic wines Traditionally, wines in Madiran, you wouldn't want to touch for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And I'm not talking about like uber expensive $300 wine, $400 wine. I mean, a lot of these Madirans are in the $20 to $40 range, or, they used to be back when I was buying some. So they were just so super tannic and so astringent. And so to kind of soften them up, what they started to do in Uruguay was blend them with softer grapes like Merlot, which is kind of a smart thing to do. But there's a lot of vineyards and a lot of winemakers like Analia Lazzaneo from Artisana Winery that are making 100% Tannats that are just drinking beautifully young. I think a part of that has to do with the weather. So Uruguay is kind of on the same latitude as like other winemaking regions, like, or countries like Australia, South Africa. So they certainly get a warmer weather. They certainly get a lot more sun than they would say in Madiran. So part of it could be where it's being grown from. Part of it is master winemaking. Analia is one of the best, if not the best, winemaker in Uruguay. And the stuff she does at Artisana is fantastic. She does a blend of like Tannat and Zinfandel. I think they're the only winery in Uruguay that grows Zinfandel, I think. And they do some whites there as well, but they're really known for their Tannat Reserva. And their Reserva is 100% Tannat. They only produce, I guess, about 250 cases of this wine. It's from Canelones. Canelones is, right now at least, the winemaking region in Uruguay. Like 80% of what anybody drinks at a Uruguay wine-wise is coming from Canelones. But Uruguay is a country, people said that about other countries, China and other things, like Chile in the 80s and 90s, but not always necessarily coming out correctly. But I think Uruguay is something you're going to see a lot more wine out of in the next 10, 15, 20 years. The vineyard sites are gorgeous. It's a great winemaking region. According to the Environmental Sustainability Index, which is published by Yale and Columbia, like if you believe in science type stuff, Uruguay actually has the purest vineyard environment in the world. What does that mean? Well, it's just kind of environmentally as clean an environment to grow grapes in as possible. I'm not a scientist, so I can't go any further, but to put it on some sort of scale, the only two countries that are more environmentally pure, according to this index, are like Finland and Norway. But good luck growing grapes and making wine in those countries. The climate's a little cooler. You might be able to get away with some sparkling wine or ice wine, but I don't think you're doing much in terms of vineyard management and winemaking up there. But so Uruguay, like other parts of South America, like Chile, like Argentina, there's just this wonderful, perfect environments for making wine. And so I expect just to see nothing but great things more to come from all three of these countries. I had a lot of fun tasting these wines. I had a great surprise with that. All these wines I've had before, except for that Carmenere, and I still am blown away by how delicious that Carmenere is. And all of these wines are great. I haven't tried the Tannat with you yet, so. Yeah, and that's great. And it's, again, this is Tannat, so there's some tannin and structure there, but I'm amazed at how fruit forward this is, how, I wouldn't call it soft, but it's softer than most Tannat you'll try, or any Tannat you'll try in France. And it's just beautiful. It's got a little bit of spice, kind of ripe red and black fruits. It almost drinks like kind of a slightly more structured Zin without the jamminess. But there is that fruit up front to it, and then you get a little bit of that spice, a little hint of earth, but I get mostly fruit and spice, and there's a depth to it. The mouthfeel of this is really fantastic. So I would do this with barbecue, I would do this with steak, but this is like, I think they're big on barbacoa in Uruguay. like kind of local different types of like asados, like wood, fire, and meat. I mean, that's big in all different parts of Central and South America in general, but Uruguay is, part of their food culture is their asados and their wood fire food, which just is making me hungry right now. So yeah, there's not a bad one in this bunch. And a couple of them are just really excellent. And I think, I don't know, I'm hard pressed. All three reds, the Torrontés I like a lot, and it's perfect, a refresher. But those three reds are on another level of quality and price to quality. It's just amazing that Pais from Chile, Carmenere from Chile, and this Tannat from Analia at Artesana are just killer stuff. So kudos to me. I'm gonna pat myself on the back. I hope you enjoy the wines as much as I did. Cheers, until next time.